John, just kind of tell me how you got involved in this case in the beginning.
Sure. The family, the parents of Finnegan, approached me about this case and felt like they just weren't getting the answers they wanted from the Fort Collins Police Department about what happened this night in January just before his senior semester started. And so I started to look into it, pouring through these reports, watching hours of body camera footage, and just seeing a number of things just not add up. And so I started asking questions of the documents, of the videos, and of the police department, and ultimately couldn't really get answers myself, but was able to try to make sense of where the investigation may have faltered and what those little holes on the night of this incident, later turned into big holes that left this case completely unexplained.
What are the holes that you've documented?
A number of the issues with the investigation that we still don't have answers to are one, why the other roommates were treated as victims from the start. They weren't questioned very closely about what happened, and now we know from new evidence that just came forward just a month or so ago that what they said wasn't true. And so we know that there were some more questions to be asked. There was some gun residue tests that weren't done. There were also a blood alcohol test that wasn't done on Colemann Carver, who's now charged with felony counts and misdemeanor counts as part of this death. So some of the evidence that would have substantiated some of these charges or maybe verified what happened that night, we just don't know. And so those big unknowns are really what drew me to the case.
Is that a fault of the initial investigation?
The initial investigation certainly didn't provide all the answers. And some of it you just can't replicate in hindsight, like a blood alcohol test or even tests on some of the evidence. The family of Finnegan is really upset that more wasn't done at the police department's level. I wanted to try to figure out what actually happened in that room, regardless of whether the investigation was conducted properly or not. The idea that a 21-year-old died days before the start of his spring semester of his senior year, and the parents are left without answers about what happened in those 5-10 minutes in his roommate's bedroom, it's a big hole, and I can't imagine as a parent being left with those questions.
You also talked to Colemann Carver's mother.
I did.
Where did what was that conversation like, and kind of what did she say to you?
There's definitely two sides, more actually, to this story, but there were two young men in that room at the time, or the two that really know what actually happened as far as the evidence shows at this point. And so I wanted to get Colemann's family's take on this, because their approach to guns, the idea that he had 4 in his bedroom, it seems foreign to the victim's family, but it's a way of life for them down in Cortez, in southwestern Colorado. So the idea that he would have these firearms is not really a big deal to them. So I wanted to get that perspective and try to explain to readers that, we had a culture clash in some ways in this bedroom on this night, and with one side being very familiar with firearms and the other side being less so. And that may have contributed to what happened. It at least contributes to our lack of understanding about what exactly took place.
What is your understanding of what happened that night from what you've been able to piece together?
The tricky part about this case is we have a police investigation from the night it happened, and now we have new evidence that just came forward, an arrest affidavit that led to these charges. They're contradictory. It's little details, for instance, whether they were drinking beer or tequila that night. But there's also big details about whether Colemann Carver, who's now charged, tampered with a weapon right after the shooting, whether he removed the magazine from the gun. That contradicts the current, or the initial investigation. More than anything, we have this Snapchat photo, which shows that these two were, at the very least, snapping photos with the guns. You could say playing around with them, as the victim's family does, moments before the shooting happened. And then the gun used in Finnegan Daly's death is actually in the hand of the roommate. It's not suggesting that he pulled the trigger, but it's raising questions about what happened between this photo and the shot being fired. And what the reports currently show is that it's not clear. We don't really know. And every time we get a couple more details, it seems to contradict other details. So at some point, whether it's at the start or this new arrest affidavit, there's lies being told in here, and we don't really know what happened. The idea is that the court process would show out exactly, put folks on the stand, try to get to the bottom of this. But it's not quite clear whether we're ever going to get answers, which has got to be tough for any family. And that was an interesting part of the story.
It seems like we're working towards a plea, which means there probably won't be any evidence presented in court. Yeah.
As anyone who's covered courts like I have knows that plea deals are pretty common. And what's interesting here is that you've got a family that's not very familiar with the court system from this victim's side, at least. Finn's parents aren't sure whether to plead here, whether this is appropriate, and whether they will feel justice from a plea deal. It's a tough thing that a lot of families go through on a day in and day out basis in the courtroom. And this family was willing to share a little bit of that with us. And I've heard from other families who have been through similar situations and know the agony and stress it causes us. You're just trying to find answers to why your son died, and you're just not getting them even in the end.
Do you think we will ever get an answer, even if this case does go to court? Do you think we'll ever have an answer of what happened that night?
I think there could be some more investigation to know exactly what happens. I know there are significant questions I'm still looking into about whether the initial report was correct, whether it could be possible, some of these initial witness statements. But again, there were two people in that room that night. One is dead and one is now on trial. So in many of these cases, no, you're left without answers.
What are your big questions remaining right now after two very thorough pieces on this? I might add, better work than most places do. What are your remaining questions?
I still want to know what happened in the moments before the shot was fired and the moments right after the shot was fired. We're just talking about minutes here. And ahead of the shot being fired, you've got the Snapchat photo showing them posing with the guns. How did the ammunition clip get back in the gun? Who picked it up? What was said? You really want to understand what led to this. But most importantly, right after the shooting, there are some minutes that are unaccounted for where 911 wasn't called. Up to 10 to 15 minutes, as the investigators have documented, where 911 wasn't called. What other calls were made? What actions did Colemann Carver take place? Some of the new evidence coming forward shows that he maybe tampered with evidence. That wasn't in some of the initial investigation. So the questions I have still remaining are, how can you have this initial investigation say one thing? You have a new investigation say something completely different. And what's the family to be left with on these big questions on how their son died and how they want to remember him, because you have to remember what they were told initially that morning, hours after the shooting, was that it was essentially a suicide.
And what happens in the police department's perspective here if you've got two completely different viewpoints of this room from two different investigations? Is there any accountability on the part of the PD? Are you hearing anything from them?
The accountability question is a big one for the victim's family. They're pushing for internal investigations. It's not clear whether those have started or whether they will take place after this. What I've heard from the police department is a statement defending their investigation, expressing remorse for the victim's family, but they wouldn't comment on whether they want to look into this. They do acknowledge through other court documents that some mistakes were made on this case. It's just a question of whether that rises to a level where disciplinary actions necessary, but that's one of the major questions going forward, even after this case is resolved.
Have you worked cases like this before?
So I've covered, before I covered politics for the Denver Post and Colorado Sun, I covered courts in Florida for years and wrote a good bit about cases like this, where the public records are so great that you get to see the gun or the knife before it happens. So I've dug in pretty deep on how investigations like this happen, investigated police officers who've conducted bad investigations, who've been fired. So I've brought a critical eye to police reports for a good long time, and it shows you need to talk to the victim's family, and they had more information than some of the police reports. Yeah, I've investigated these things before, and this is still, it's got to be one of the ones that will end with the most questions. Because I'm not sure we're ever going to know what happened in the moments right before or the moments right afterward, though if it does go to trial, there's a possibility we could learn a little more.
Do you think there was a failure on behalf of the police department here in the beginning?
It's hard to tell. I'm certainly not an expert on how police work should be conducted, but from investigative reports I've read before, there are certain things that were not done. And this is what the victim's family is telling me, such as the blood alcohol test, such as some of the other forensics tests. The family really doesn't understand why they weren't done, and the explanations from the police department seem to contradict some of their more recent statements. So it looks like, as the victim's family says, that the cops felt like they figured out what happened and didn't really dig deep enough, at least not to get all the answers in this case.
What else am I missing?
A really interesting element of this is the perception of guns and firearms. Finnegan Daly's mother, Regina, says she's not one of these gun nuts, as she says in her words, but she definitely sees her son's case as one of these situations that could have been avoided with tougher gun laws. For instance, the magazine clip in the handgun had more than the legal number of rounds. Now, this is possible if it was purchased before Colorado made it illegal, but we don't have answers on when they purchased it, and that really frustrates her. The idea that he had 4 guns in a house with at least 3 to 4 college students, seems like something that shouldn't have happened in her mind. And the idea that they would just be kept under the bed. She would like to see more stringent regulations and wonders why they're not enforced in this case. For instance, Colemann Carver, who's charged, he had a handgun. He's not old enough to buy one. Now in Colorado, you're allowed to pass one, gift one from a family member. And so she struggled to really understand some of the caveats in our gun laws in Colorado, which a lot of people tout as some of the best in the nation, but there's some fine print to some of them, and this is a case where the victim's family is really learning how they apply in real life, and that's very different from how they're perceived in the public. So that disconnect is another interesting, but in their minds frustrating part of this case.
And then you have the other side of the coin with Colemann Carver's family.
Yeah, when I talked to Coleman's mother, she said this is just part of their culture, that he and his father collect guns, and I've known many people that have done that. It's particularly out west here. It's not that uncommon, but it brought to the city life, so to speak, of Fort Collins. We had a culture clash and a misunderstanding about each side. And both families are hurting here. When I talk to the mothers of both sides, both have questions, both have unanswered details about what happened, and I think both are seeking answers, which makes this a pretty tragic case on both sides, regardless of what happens.
Yeah. The one thing that I think triggers everyone's attention is when you see in the current affidavit that he failed 2 polygraph tests.
Yeah.
About whether or not he shot him. What's your challenge in covering something like that? I imagine, inadmissible evidence, so you can't really focus on it. But.
Yeah, when it comes to polygraph tests, they're not entirely reliable. We've known this for years. We've seen convictions overturned because of them. But what it does show, in my mind, is that there's a lot. It just reinforces that there's questions we don't have answered. Whether they answered them truthfully or not, we don't know, which is, again, another question. And they asked some pretty probing questions about whether he shot Finnegan Daly. And the results came out that, there's a potential that he's lying in his answer. So until we see the transcript of those questions, we won't really know for sure how damning they might be. And of course, we're not going to see a lot of this in court. But it just only adds to the fact that we've got 2 different accounts of what happened that night from the only lone survivor of that bedroom. And we may not know. And that's tough for the families on both sides.